We are about to start on part 4 of our oral history series. And I wanted to start by asking you just to talk a little bit about your career at Grand Valley. How long did you teach there? How long were you part of that community?
I was a full-timer for 25 years, from 1969 in the fall to through December of 1994. So I retired officially January 1, 95. So it's been just about 26 years.
Right.
Now I should say that first quarter I was only half-time in the psychology department, because I had just been appointed in the summer after making a phone call. So there was no room for me at the time for a regular full-time spot. But the vice president at that time thought enough of the possibility to getting me there that he appointed me for a half-time temporary position, but with some extra money, which was nice. But then in the second quarter, starting in January, I became a full-timer because the counseling center wanted me also for a half-time position. So it's really from January 1, 1970 through December of 94 that I was a full-timer at Grand Valley.
And did you decide that it was time to retire? What was...
Yes. I was going to be 66 in 94, and so I decided after that I should retire. I did continue some adjunct teaching for a couple of years, but that was just one or at most 2 courses.
Well, it seems to me in academia, people go much longer. My wife, I think she worked until her late 70s. And then they also had a program called phased retirement, where it started out, phased retirement was 5 years of half-time. And when she retired, it was 3 years.
Yes, I guess I could have done that. Actually, that's what my oldest daughter is doing right now. She has started half-time this year for the first year, that she is half retired or semi-retired.
Right.
And she will do that for a few years, and then she'll go in full-time retirement.
So what I was asking you is that seems you were 66 for an academic. Did you have other things you wanted to do? Did you have other plans?
Oh, yes.
What was your life
There
like?
was plenty to do yet that I had to postpone. Well, for one thing, traveling. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do more traveling. And there was studying more just the topics I wanted to study rather than for my teaching. So it was partly that, and partly because I thought 66 is it's a good time to go into retirement. Who knows how old you are going to be, so make use of the time that you are still healthy enough to really do something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm I think looking back for my wife, she didn't have much left over after she retired. And even at her age, she still didn't want to retire, even though she had volunteered for the phased retirement program. When it came time, she felt that they forced her out.
Oh.
And I thought, because she declined very quickly after stopping going to school. And I think that, so your decision seems, more wise.
Oh, I don't know about more wise, but it certainly was more pleasant for me because I still had many good years after I officially retired that I could function quite well intellectually, physically, one of the things I started doing almost right away after I retired is giving more lectures at the church where I had been doing that for quite a while. And now I could concentrate more on what I wanted to lecture about in the church.
What church were you talking
It
about?
was Fountain Street Church.
Tell me a little bit about Fountain Street Church. How did you end up with a relationship with them?
Well, it's again a complicated story. When I was at Calvin, toward the end of my time there, I started a number of group discussions. That was in those days, and a lot of students wanted that. And in one of those groups, with seminary students, I encountered for the first time Bruce Bodie, who later became a minister and a missionary for the Christian Reformed Church in Guam, and then came back and started working on his master's degree, but that's when he began to ask some difficult questions for the church, the seminary, and ended up at Fountain Street Church as an assistant to the then rather famous, I almost said notorious, Reverend Duncan Littlefair, who was quite a liberal thinker and quite a character too. So Bruce then left the Christian Reformed Church after he got into some controversy with the seminary professors, and tried to go to Littlefair and ask if he could find a job for him, and Littlefair did. And Bruce Bodie became the director of education for Fountain Street Church, as well as a preacher, and particularly gave help with funerals and so on, funeral services. So Bruce Bodie was the education man at Fountain Street Church still in the 1980s. And that's when Fountain Street Church, because of Bruce Bodie's work, got more Jungian type lectures to come in and, give some educational information about Jung. And they wanted to show at a given moment a number of movies about Jung, including a famous interview with Freeman of the BBC. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, because that's a really important interview in many ways. And the three-part series by Lawrence Venderpost, which has become a classic for introductory Jung classes. And so they would show those movies in one evening and have Littlefair as a commentator. But they wanted somebody else too. And at that time, I had become a little bit more known in this area as somebody who was interested in Jung. So they asked me to come and be a commentator along with Littlefair. And that was reason for Fountain Street Church soon after to ask me to give more lectures about, at first, particularly Jung. And I managed to find a compromise with Grand Valley as a school to spend time at Fountain Street Church by offering classes, regular Grand Valley classes, but in a room that the church, Fountain Street Church, made available, so that students would visit the lectures in that room, in that church. But it was then also open to members of the church, Fountain Street Church. If they wanted to sit in lectures, they could. And that worked quite well. It became a very animated sort of combination of regular students and church members who would listen to a lecture and participate in question and answer periods and so on. And some of them even wanted to take the exams, which was kind of funny, and discovered to their own, well, amazement, but also disappointed somewhat that they weren't quite as easy in those exams as they thought they would be compared with the students. So that became a regular thing. And pretty soon, not only classes for the college, but also just lectures in general for the church became a sort of yearly excursion of mine for, 15 years or more. Well, that was very nice. And that's how I ended up giving many lectures at Fountain Street Church.
Did you develop a relationship with Duncan Littlefair at all during that time?
No, he was about to retire. And after a few years, when I started there, he retired. And I never developed much of a relationship with him. He didn't, as a rule, I think, with most of the lecturers, not even with Joseph Campbell.
Did you ever attend any of his talks or his sermons?
Joseph Campbell? Oh, yeah.
No, I'm talking about Duncan.
Oh, I went to some of his sermons, and I also came to a couple of his discussion evenings with members of the church about just about anything.
Right.
And I always enjoyed that. He was a remarkable man.
Yeah. Did Joseph Campbell come to Fountain Street Church?
Several times, yes.
Really? I never saw him.
And he was very, very fond of coming there. He was proud to be able to give a lecture in a real church of the Protestant type. So he was there at least 2, and I think maybe 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, I know I mentioned to you I saw Robert Johnson there twice.
Yeah, I saw him many times.
I really appreciate
4
it.
or 5 times,
Okay,
I think.
I saw him twice.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it. Yeah, was there anything going on in the culture at the time that made this work? The ideas that touched people? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, the Flower Children.
What was it about that time?
70s. Well, they all were looking for alternatives to the old, also in religion. And, well, that's where Jung came up. It's a kind of natural thing. Because, well, Jung was so much more than just a psychologist with ideas about, personality and psychotherapy. Well, he was that, of course, but he was so much more than that, including religion. He was a very deep and knowledgeable student of different religions, has written a lot about that, and there were many Jungians who were preaching or teaching about that. So it was kind of natural for many of the people in the late 60s and 70s, 80s to become interested in Jung.
Right. Anything come to mind about his ideas and how the young people connected to it? Well, I asked you earlier, I think, this term, Jungian term called individuation. Can you...
Oh, that idea certainly also struck home with a lot of the young people.
Can you explain what that term means?
Well, it often got to mean something for them, and for the evangelistic preachers on television who were going against that, something that Jung never meant it to be. What it started to mean for them, many of the young, was indeed that, well, it's all up to yourself. It's what you think, what you believe, what you want, what you feel, especially what you feel. That's what it's all about. That's not what Jung meant by it at all. Jung had sometimes the weird habit of taking a word and trying to go back to the most original sort of meaning that he could extract from it. And so if you look at the word individuation, well, that means not, in, divided within yourself. So becoming whole, if you want to put it in those terms of that time, becoming more complete, not one-sided, and trying to become complete also, particularly actually, for you in the sense of finding that the most important part of you is not just you, but is something much bigger, more collective, more deep, if you will, your deeper self, or your deeper inner self is another term that might be used here. So that is not a sort of egocentric view of the word individuation than it later became. The same is true, by the way, of self-actualization. As people like Maslow and Rogers wanted to use it, where it's that better self, that deeper self, that is what you try to actualize, not what your ego wants or likes.
Right.
They make a real difference between, if you will, ego and self.
Right.
You know, for Jung, that self has to be with capital S. Well, that's what individuation meant to Jung.
And you think that a lot of younger people misunderstood that about
Yes,
what
they
Jung meant
did.
by it? Yeah?
Yeah,
How so?
they became very egocentric. They
How
thought
so?
it's all about what I feel.
Ah,
And that is an exaggeration toward part of your bigger self than what people like Jung or Maslow actually meant. That's why the difference between ego and self is important in that connection. But yeah, if you begin to identify your ego with the real self, then you get in trouble. And that is what did happen to a lot of young people,
right.
as well as older people for that matter.
Well, I'm curious about that. The world of feelings, or in an intuitive sense, that you know something intuitively, isn't that a feeling too? Isn't the access to
No, that kind of intuition is not just a feeling.
well, not
It's
just
a perception first.
okay.
That's what the word intuit itself actually means. It's a form of perception.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an emotion, first of all. An emotion is a temporary thing that says something about the state of the organism, you as a whole, right now. A feeling is already much more tied to the ego, if you will. It's a state of the ego, you might say, and it's more lasting. You don't say, if you hurt my feelings, you don't say, you hurt my emotions. There is a real difference between emotion and feeling, and that is something a lot of people forget. They mistake their emotions for their feelings. But a feeling is much more something more lasting that says something about yourself, your ego, if you will. Okay, so does that make any sense?
Yeah, especially that distinction between emotions and feelings.
Yeah, a lot of people mistake that.
Right.
And in the common language, that is often done too.
Mm-hmm.
Many people say something, oh, I feel like this. What they mean is they have an emotion like that. So we often don't make those distinctions anymore that used to be really meaningful in words that we use. And that is why Jung sometimes wanted to give a very special meaning to words he used, like the word ego, like the word individuation. It makes a difference how you use your words.
Right. Yeah. Well, this idea of fulfillment, okay, and
Yeah, but what do you fulfill?
right.
Just
So,
your ego, your sense of satisfaction, your sense of accomplishment,
What
Yes.
happens when you're hungry and you eat food
Well,
and you get full? It's a feeling of fullness,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So food or thirst are often associated metaphorically to the thirst of the soul, or my
yes, yes.
hunger for the truth.
Yes.
That's there's a scriptural psalm, as the heart panteth after the water brook, so panteth my soul after thee, O Lord.
Yes. Yeah.
This idea that there is a thirst, that there is a hunger within us.
And that should be recognized
Right.
as wanting to reach for something more than just your own satisfaction or pleasure or success.
Right.
That is the ego that is then satisfied, not that self.
Right.
That is a deeper lying heart of the matter in you. And for that, you might be willing to go through a lot of negative feelings, negative emotions. You might be willing to sacrifice a lot of your own pleasures and satisfactions in order to satisfy that deeper hunger or thirst, if you will. And that's what is often forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
And individuation only means satisfaction. But individuation may require that you give up something of pleasure. It may actually make you decide not to eat, or to starve yourself,
Mm-hmm.
or to go on a hunger strike, or that's not because you want to satisfy your ego.
Right.
That's because you want to satisfy the deeper hunger for something beyond your own satisfaction.
Yes.
And a lot of people find that absolute nonsense, because they say you are here for your own satisfaction and pleasure. Well, that's not what Jung is about.
So they become renunciants.
Well, it could be.
They renounce the world. And they, there's...
Well, they may do it in order to find a deeper purpose for that
Right.
world.
But that's a common, over the ages, the monasteries, the people saying, I have to sacrifice.
Yes.
This world is a place that tries to tempt me. It just all sounds very Christian to me at some point, that around every corner there's temptation.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to... And so if I deny myself all the pleasures that the world has to offer, then I'll become a holy person,
And that's a misunderstanding too.
And then with Duncan, because I attended a lot of his lectures, his sermons, he thought the highest aspiration available to mankind was through the intellect. That was kind of his. He rejected anything about feelings, whether they're higher aspirations, or just the emotional self, but his idea in the pure intellect. And I often felt like that seemed kind of limited to me as well, that it could just be, if only we could think clearer, everything would become clearer to us.
Oh, may I disagree with you?
That's how I heard. What are you disagreeing with?
Maybe you heard that, but that is what Little Fair meant. It happens so often that people hear something that somebody else says, but they don't really hear what the person meant.
Right.
They hear something that fits their own feelings or already made conclusions, and not really does it an attempt to find out what does he really mean. Because if you look at the word intellectus, intellectus originally in Latin, that does not mean just rationality. That's a much broader terms than that. And it includes quite possibly also feelings or even emotions. It means to really see, perceive into something, intellectus. And that has become more and more over the centuries in our culture identified with being just rational, being just logical. Put away emotions and put away feelings. That's not important. That's not what it originally meant. Just as the word rationalism originally did not mean simply logical in the sense that we today use it. And I think little fair meant intellect in the original sense that is much more and much deeper than simply rational thinking. It's not just thinking, it is also seeing, perceiving, which is a different kind of function. Talking about Jung, he has two very different functions there in his personality theory. There is the function of thinking rationally, and there is the function of intuition. And they can go together, that's good, but they're not the same. So if you are just rational, then you forget that you have this other kind of perceiving things, perceiving the truth, seeing through it, and that is intuition. Does this make a little sense?
Yes, it does. It makes a lot of sense, and I think
Little Fair would be disappointed if you would tell him, but you're only a rationalist.
right.
Oh, no. No.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying. That you're saying to me, maybe you heard him wrong. It's kind of how I'm thinking. Oh, and that's unfortunate because
Yes.
there was something I recognized about him and admired, but often went and maybe developed a misunderstanding because as an institution, the church, the Found Street Church, and what they brought to me as an individual person seeking clarity, seeking wisdom, seeking teaching, it provided a lot, in the community for that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the same thing as the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Wisdom is a heck of a lot more than just knowing a lot of things. I think I've known some people who had a great deal of knowledge and were very unwise in just about everything,
Right.
especially in relationships.
Yeah, well, that's good. So let's talk about how this has evolved for you as a human being and the difference in your life between wisdom and knowledge. Because the other part for me is about practices, which has also the word practical. What is it? Many religions offer a practice, right? If you do this, this here's a prescribed system that you should do. Pray at this time, do this ritual, do that. Our history is full of prescribed rituals.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Was there any of that kind of practice that you could adopt or recommend for people in this process of individuation?
Oh, I would be very hesitant to do that.
Okay.
Because that is so individually different as to what will work. And different people can use different practices as long as they do it in order to reach a better goal or to reach more toward that goal. Too often the practice becomes its own goal, if you will, and then it becomes dead in what it actually manages to accomplish for the individual. How many people just don't go through practices because it's the routine they have become used to. And routine can be great, but if it's only the routine that now counts, then it's no longer doing what it was meant to do, which is a danger we all have to face as we get older. Why do you do that? Oh, I've always done it that way. Well, so try something else. but often that is then too much work. No, I cannot not say that in my own life there has been all that much of a breaking with practices in order to try something else. I didn't have those routines, those practices. My life has been too variable in too many ways for too long, perhaps. Well, starting from a very young age as a toddler in the Indies, it was common, certainly for a teacher like my father, to be often placed in a new school somewhere else. If you were somewhere for 4, 5, 6 years, that was a lot of time already to be allowed to stay in one place. There were many changes fairly quickly after a few years. So as a very young child already, I learned to, well, at a given moment we have to go. And then you leave just about everything behind, including the habits you might have formed, and go somewhere else and start again. And that could be quite a distance, by the way, between those places where you ended up now here, now then, somewhere else. And my life has been like that all my life. Remember, I told you on the day that my wife and I got the keys to a new apartment where we were envisioned to stay and live a steady life for quite a while to come. On that day, there came a letter from Grand Rapids, Michigan, to ask if I wanted to come there and teach. And then we did that. And then at Calvin, there was supposed to be a long time engagement for certainly me and the college, and very much an institute. After 7 years, I left. Then Grand Valley, unexpectedly, because I had planned to be there only a few years maybe, that became more than 25 years. So, no, my life has not been characterized by long-time practices of this, that, or the other.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And even at Grand Valley, what I really did there often changed. I started as chairman of the department, but before long I felt, no, I don't want to do this. And we found somebody else to become chairman, who did it for more than 25 years as chairman. But I started doing other things. And then came Fountain Street Church as a very important side job for me. That for my own interest became sometimes at least as important as the teaching certain classes at the college. So, no, it's been too much of a varied life for me to be able to, well, settle down.
Well, I think that period of the 70s, do you remember hearing from Frank Zappa?
Yes.
He called it Eastern Intrigue, that a lot of young people were looking to the East, to India, to Eastern religions and Eastern philosophies and Eastern.
Yeah, and China.
China, yeah. And that became, Westerners traveled to India to find teachers. There was a colleague of Timothy Leary at Harvard, Richard Alpert.
Yeah.
And became Ram Dass. He came to Grand Valley several times too.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, to TJC. Who was it? Allen Ginsberg. So I think that because I was caught up in that myself, that might have been where Duncan came out quite opposed to.
That's what Jung was too.
Jung was opposed to looking at other cultures?
No, but to try to become like it was your culture.
Uh-huh.
He always insisted, you are a Westerner. And as a Westerner, it's great to get to know the East, if you will. And he himself was quite a deep student of Buddhism particularly, but not so much of Hinduism, but of Buddhism, and certainly also of Chinese philosophy and so on, especially after he got pulled into the work of people that had started translating the Lao Zedong and things like that. No, he was very open to getting to know more about other cultures. But if you want to find the real light, go as deep as possible in your own culture. That's where you find the same thing in the end anyway. And to try to mimic the other culture as if you had grown up in that won't work. That is a betrayal of many things. You will, for one thing, never really become like somebody who grew up in that culture. Even though you try very hard, you can get very far. But it will never be as complete as if you had done the same, going in depth, in your own culture. So that's where Jung would probably agree, I think, with Little Fair. Not that it's bad to get to know that other culture. On the contrary, try to understand as much as possible of that. That's what Jung did. He didn't get 2 honorary doctorates in India for nothing. They knew about him too. So he knew that culture. You know what he once said to a woman who wrote about that to him? He said, well, you have Christianity, that is my background, my culture. And I've never wanted to live that. But then you have Buddhism. And those two are almost equivalent. If I had to choose from the start which one, I might even prefer Buddhism. But I'm a Christian in origin.
Right.
And that's why he went so deeply into the personality of Jesus, of the Christ, and was very much also in agreement with, who was it who said that again? Don't just be a Christian, be a Christ, which is very different sometimes. And I think Jung might have agreed with the other man who said, with Jesus up there in heaven looking back at what those Christians had been doing for the last 1,500 years or so after he died, boy, I'm glad I'm a Christ, not a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's interesting. Because the contribution of the studying the myths, the stories of other cultures, would, have a tendency to adopt some of those, to say, oh, I think I like a philosophy of that, and then maybe not finding that. It's Joseph Campbell talked about myth and transparent to transcendence.
Yeah.
That was a very powerful idea to me.
You don't need a myth just for that. I mean, not just a myth can do that. Other things can do that too.
Right.
For me, that would be music, first of all.
Right.
More so even than myth. But of course, myth can do that. By the way, about this business of trying to adopt another culture with another myth, I remember reading, who was it again? I don't remember exactly who said it, but it was one of those true mystics of the West who also went east and lived for a while with mystics of, in this particular case, Buddhism and Hinduism. And he discovered there that with those mystics of an entirely different culture, he had more in common than he had with the ministers, or in his case, the priests in his own Roman Catholic Church. He said, if you go deep enough into it, you find that you indeed were all looking for the same thing.
Yeah.
And when you get closer to that, you grow closer and closer to the other people who are doing the same thing. That's why in the end it might not make much difference whether you grow up first in this culture or that culture or another culture. Just go deep enough and you will find the same core. And you would agree with that. And that's why today, even today yet, well, I don't know about the last 15 years, I haven't been there, but still in the 90s, for instance, when you would go to the Eranos conference, which I did a few times in Switzerland, where people from all over the world now come together to have lectures and discussions at the highest scholarly level, by the way. These are all top scholars in their culture. That you find them from all kinds of cultures. When I was there, it was very exciting, but also dizzying, because you had lectures going on every day, twice, and now you had to listen to English, then you had to listen to German, then you had to listen to French, then you had to listen to Italian. You had to try to keep up with that. It's because we were scholars from all those cultures, plus Easterners who usually would talk English then, because if they start talking in Chinese or Hindi, nobody understands it except themselves and a few adepts. So it's still, now as I was in those conferences, that it is a very multicultural, in the best sense of the word, a combination of people that come together to share ideas, also particularly from their scholarly viewpoint in a particular culture. So I have always liked that idea. If you just go deep enough into your own background, but you have to go really deep, you will find the same things as people in other cultures have done, who did the same thing there. And I think it's true.
Yeah.
We are all human beings in the end, aren't we?
Right.
Well, sometimes you wonder, but...
Well, I remember Robert Johnson, when, went to his lectures.
He was
10
trying
years.
to be Indian sometimes.
He lived in India
Yeah,
for 10 years. And he spoke about that. And he spoke about it, not that he had converted to Hinduism. He says, I am a Christian. He still claimed that. I was surprised that he would do that, but he spoke about it just exactly the way you understand it.
He was a true Jungian, by the way.
Yeah.
He went to Zurich, he went to Switzerland, he was in analysis there with Jacobi, and he was really a Jungian.
Don't you think analysis is somewhat of what I'm talking about with the practice? Sitting with a teacher, sitting with a wise one, explaining your conflicts, explaining your dreams, your inner life.
If that's what it is, then it's not an analysis.
So what is analysis? How would you describe that?
That is somebody who helps you find out what's alive and true in you.
Right.
And that's not by telling you.
No, but it's you helping you.
It's helping you, right.
But would you would not use the word master.
No.
In that context.
Oh, no. That's what Freud still tried to remain too much, too long.
Uh-huh.
That would be the critique of Jung.
Right.
No. Jung was fond of saying, if you really want to help people, you should start out with the real conviction, I don't know anything, especially when it comes to dreams. And only if you begin like that and you start working together as equals in many, many ways, then you can get somewhere with that person. But it's that person that you should try to help. It's not what you know as an analyzer. That's not what counts. And apparently that was the experience of people who went into analysis with Jung. That he was not trying to tell them anything that he knew so much as helping you figure it out. And then he gave everything that he had. And I heard that from somebody, a woman, who was at first put off by him. And she particularly didn't want to get a transference, as they call it, right? An Übertragung. And she was determined she was going to analysis with him, but she was not going to develop a transference. And then she later said, but of course I did. And that's because he gave so much, not by instruction of as the master, but in helping me in what I was doing. And that was why he was a master therapist. He really was.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yes, yes. It does. Just thinking of this idea of God helps those who help themselves, right? You've heard that phrase?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
But that also then means you try to help yourself, not in the sense of to find the most satisfaction or the most success or the most emotionally pleasant kind of experiences. That's not to help yourself. That's to help your ego. But to help yourself requires more than that. Which may give a moment to people in a true psychotherapy and analysis that they have to look at what they have done so far as a failure, and that they have to really change. And not too many people are willing to do that.
Right.
So it's that word self that is very critical here. What do you mean by that?
Go ahead and tell me. What do you mean by that?
Well, the common language has that word in the proper meaning in some forms, in several forms. When I say, I'm trying to become my better self, I'm not talking about my ego. I'm talking about that something deeper that I sort of sense must be there, and I haven't reached it, but I will try to. That's a different way of talking about yourself. Make it two words instead of one. And the common language has a great deal of very deep wisdom in it. Only too often we don't hear that anymore. We have lost much of the subtlety that words in the common language actually still carry around. You know where it sometimes comes out? In dreams. That's where also the image that originated the word a long time ago may come up again. A neat example of that, that's of my own past. A man who in the dream is walking pleasantly along outside. The sun is shining, it's nice weather. And then he heard something rumbling behind him. So he looks back and he sees a hill, and the hill moves.
Mm.
And then he stops and looks at that, and the hill comes closer and closer and becomes a mountain and grows more and more as a mountain, and eventually comes really close and threatening to fall over on him and crush him. But he has been in analysis for a little while, and he knows, oh, this is a dream that is important. Now I have to do what I was advised to do, face it.
Mm.
So he doesn't turn around and runs. He stays there and waits what's going to happen when that mountain comes closer and closer. And then it starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And when it is smaller than himself, he can start looking down at it.
Mm.
And finally, it turns into a mouse, and it's gone.
Mm.
And he wakes up. Now, do you recognize a saying in the language that really is an original image that is the background, the origin of that saying?
Making a mountain out of a molehill.
That would be one, but the other one, now this is in Dutch, says in Dutch, means exactly the same thing. The mountain born a mouse, has born a mouse. That is what looked like such a huge kind of threat. When you really face it down, it will get smaller, and eventually it will just be a little thing that disappears.
Right.
And it means you better start facing the troubles that now scare the heck out of you.
Right.
It's a very simple image in a way, but it says a whole lot if you're willing to listen. But you had forgotten that kind of meaning in the original image, but it comes back in a dream. And so it can happen more often in dreams. I've seen it happen in my practice. Ini has seen it happen many times in her practice, that in a dream you get an original image back that you had totally dispensed from your regular vocabulary,
Right.
and you never think of it anymore.
When you talk about in terms of your practice, is that to mean when you are being an analysis for other people? Is that your practice? Okay.
Yes.
Because there's that word again.
Yeah.
Practice.
Yeah. Counseling.
Practice, though,
is a common word for that.
Because to me, that idea of practice, because I say sometimes, because I was shown a practice, that I am a heart specialist with a private practice. Taking that word that people in the medical community, he's a practicing doctor, he's a practicing Jungian psychologist. That means he has a practice. But I just listen and I hear that word, practice, which is the same word we use when we talk about he's a practicing Jew, he's a practicing Christian. And hearing that word also about practical, something to do in this world, some steps that you take, that you adopt, or like music. You talked a lot about your love of the violin.
Oh boy, the practicing that takes.
Yes.
And it's not just that you do it, but you do it with a purpose. It's in order to achieve a particular kind of know-how.
Right.
And the practice itself should serve that purpose. And only too often it can become its own purpose. That you start doing the same thing over and over again just to do it, and no longer because you want that something else that is more important to be better achieved.
Right.
And when you practice the scales on the piano or on a violin or any other instrument, that sometimes threatens to become its own purpose. And then it's of course wrong.
Right.
And then you hear it in the way the individual plays. It will be technically perfect, maybe, or perfect, but the soul is gone
Right.
of it. It hasn't served the purpose for a while. It has become practice in its own right, as it were, or for its own benefit.
Right. So that was where this idea from Campbell, where he said transparent to transcendence, and he was talking about symbols. A symbol should be transparent to transcendence. And I thought about the cross in my experience of a symbol that I had grown up with, a symbol that was always present in our churches, and I think interesting in Protestantism because the cross is under, for 1,000, 1,500 years became very elaborate, right? And they actually included this figure of a man being tortured.
Oh, yeah.
And then the Protestant Reformation made it simple again, right? And then I thought about this idea of transparent to transcendence. Well, what does that mean? It means that when I look at the cross, the vision stops there. It doesn't go any further. If I would see it,
then it's not really a symbol anymore.
Then it's not a symbol.
Oh.
It has to be transparent to transcendence. So now I look at the cross and I see through it. And then what does it reveal? All kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But that was the kind of, it was a cultural conflict that had to happen to say to the elders, your vision is stopping. You're not experiencing the full depth of what this image represents, because you have all these rules, and you have, like you said last time, human sexuality is so, you look at that and it has to be like this, or my whole experience of that culture, which presented to me almost in a damaging way, that I felt that it had done some damage. It had done, it had ruined some innocence, some natural way of looking at people, that it was openness and loving, turned into this narrow judgment, critical, this is the kind of people you are. And so what opened me up was Joseph Campbell, but also this introduction to the world of other cultures, of Eastern mysticism, and this idea of that prayer wasn't petitioning the Lord for things, that it was it was being still and knowing that there was a knowledge, a knowing to the process, right? Which is why I keep, thinking, when I heard you say practice, I was feeling like, there we are again. That I've looked for practices, ways, and often ritual, a prescribed method of doing, I think that was one of the gifts of the East again, was yoga. That there was even some kind of way you could exercise that was a union, not only with your physical body, but also uniting the spirit and the body. Again, so different than Western ways, so I feel like I've been the real beneficiary of those philosophies and thinking about them differently, and also hearing the piece about, because, Joseph Campbell said, we as Americans should adopt the mythology of this land here, which is Native American. And yet there was this sense of that what we do as the dominant culture is appropriate cultures, right? We take them on ourselves and then we kind of change them and wonder what's wrong with that, you know? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah. And Campbell, of course, was right when he pointed at symbols and myth as one way in which you can get some kind of sense, perception of the transcendent, that which goes beyond the obvious, the material, the common. But there are other ways of doing that. As I think I said, music was for me a way to get that. Not all music. And of course, that brings up the danger also of it. And that may be part of the reason why the practice can lead to an exclusion of the sense of transcendence. If the practice becomes for its own sake,
Takes over.
the thing. That if you open yourself up to experience, you may find something that's extremely valuable, beautiful, but if you are really open to experience, you will also necessarily experience the opposite as a possibility. And I think a lot of people, especially in the Christian church over the last several hundred years, have become afraid of that. If they open themselves up to experience, what are they going to experience? And maybe particularly when it comes to sexuality, if you look at what the Western culture, especially also in America, I must say, in the last several hundred years, well, let's say until about 1950, has done with that aspect of life, most of it has been avoidance of what might become troublesome. Let's keep it safe. And if you open yourself up to experience, you open yourself up to all kinds of experience. You cannot be too selective in that. So you have to discover the possibilities in yourself also of the bad along with the good. This was, by the way, one of the things that for Jung was so important, to recognize the reality of evil in nature, including yourself. And he, in the end, broke with one of his two best friends, the Roman Catholic priest, on that point, because the Roman Catholic priest remained loyal to Rome, teaching that in the final analysis, evil does not exist as real. It's like a shadow from something that doesn't get the light. And if you only add more light, the shadow just disappears. It never was real in the first place. And so it is with evil over against good. And so you get that famous privatio bonum, privatio boni dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. Evil is the absence of the good. It's the being separated from God. In itself, it is nothing. And Jung said, oh no, that's a misunderstanding of what real reality is like. It is both. And we have to become aware of that. We may have to experience it as Christ did. And that's going to be quite a job. And so it is with many things. If you want to experience beauty, you have to, at a given moment, face the fact that that same vehicle that can give you so much beauty can become ugly and really kind of sordid and evil too. Well, look at music, look at painting, which should be something that allows transparency toward beauty. That's why you have paintings that become so valuable. But look at how ugly and sordid and in a way, evil paintings can become, the visual arts in general. Uh, and and that is something that for a lot of people is too much. They don't want experience because it has a risk to it. And and may I give an example?
Yes, please.
If there's time. I walked through the Museum of Art in Washington, and they have a tremendous room with paintings of Rembrandt, the Rembrandt room. And I like painting, but it never was something so particularly important to me. And I didn't have the experience with it that, for instance, my younger brother has developed over the years. But I still enjoy it. I like it, and some I like better than others. And I walked through that room. I said, oh, that's a Rembrandt room. Well, oh, yeah, that's beautiful. Hey, that's nice. And then I stopped. That's what Campbell also talks, being arrested by the transcendent. There was a painting by Rembrandt of Paul in jail with his sword and so on. And I still to this day don't know what it was about that particular one painting that did it to me. But I stopped and I was sort of in a trance for at least a minute or two. I just couldn't take my eyes off it. Everything disappeared. I had no idea who else might be in that room. There was something about that painting that just literally almost arrested me. That is, made me stop. That's what the word arrest means, doesn't it? Make you stop what you are doing. And then I sort of woke up. That was a moment of transcendence for me. Then I walk out of the museum and I see some of the ugliest scenes I've ever seen on that large square there with some people walking around, and I don't even remember what the details were, but it's like suddenly the opposite of what I had just experienced in that museum. Something just utterly ugly, and it had to do with a visual kind of image. And one of those stalls that are there on the sidewalks on that large square in the middle of Washington, D.C. And that's what I think a lot of people are too afraid of. They don't want to experience this because, well, it might lead to that. And that's certainly true for sexuality.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting.
I hope it makes a little sense.
It does. I enjoy the ideas and thinking about them in my own life. And I think I really appreciated learning about the shadow side of things that as Jungians would talk about it, right? That
Yeah, and remember, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow is going to be
right.
of something.
Yeah, as Einstein had a quote about as the circle of light increases, so does the area of darkness around it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
That was a beautiful concept to embrace, to understand, that was so misunderstood in Christian education that I received, you know. So appreciate it. So any more reflections? I think of myself as an emerging elder, and Paul Simon has a line: "I'm older than I once was, but I'm younger than I'll be." And he says, after changes upon changes, we are more or less the same. But I keep feeling like I'm going into more of a contemplative phase in my life.
I would say it's about time then.
is that have you entered that phase? Are you a contemplative?
I think I've always been that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, more or less, but now more than before when it was less.
And does
But
your study and your understanding of Jung help with that?
very greatly.
Yeah.
Very greatly, because he had to go through the same thing. And he's one psychologist who is not afraid of using his own experience as a model for understanding also other people. Most psychologists, especially in academia these days here in America, are afraid of, of having their own private experiences intrude into what they want to just do as objective science. It's that model of thinking, of pure science, that stays away from anything personal, that I think has invaded a lot of psychology these days in the United States. And I think it's a pity.
Wasn't that originally the argument that Freud gave to Jung, saying Freud was really wanted to establish this as a new science and
But as a
scientific
Wissenschaft, not a science in the contemporary Anglo-Saxon sense of the word, but as Wissenschaft, that is, as the making of knowledge, understanding,
right,
which is a lot more than just the rational analysis that so-called objective science is supposed to produce.
right. But Freud represented that opinion, right? That's what he was hoping it would become. And Jung,
yeah, Jung too. Jung always insisted, I'm a
but
scientist.
what was the split between the two? What was that all about?
Different things. For one thing, Freud never understood and never trusted religion. He wanted to get rid of it because he could explain it in his psychopathology terms. For Jung, religious experience always was the most important final goal of certainly his life. So that was one thing. And when it comes to the studying of the unconscious, Freud sort of stopped at what was more personal, except for a few ideas like the Oedipus complex, which he saw as the first collective unconscious product that he encountered in his practices as a psychotherapist. But on the whole, Freud wanted to think of the unconscious as the repository of what once was conscious for you, but then became unconscious. And except for a few things like the Oedipus complex, there was nothing else. And he certainly wasn't ready to start thinking about the unconscious having particular wisdom, as it were, that underlies our individual awareness and consciousness. And that's what Jung, actually from the very start, did sense. He went along with Freud for quite a while. Well, quite a while, 7 years. Is that very much in the life of a young man still developing as an Wissenschaftler, somebody who tries to develop more understanding and knowledge about things? And that was in 1902, Jung discovered Freud by reading the analysis of dreams, for instance, and in the meantime developed his own expertise in experimental psychology in the laboratory with word associations and so on. But then he discovered something that fit Freud. He discovered in his experiments something that nobody paid any attention to, although it had been noticed before. That is that there were little things happening when people associate one word to another that was a disturbance. And that was strange. And that was something that the individual never even realized at that moment. So where did it come from? From the unconscious. Oh, Freud was right. There is such a thing. He began to find out. And then he wrote about that and sent a book about it that he wrote in 1906 to Freud. And Freud said, here's the man who is beginning to understand me really at a high level. Freud had students at that time, but they were disciples, but he didn't really respect them all that much. But he recognized immediately in Jung, hey, this is a real one. So a little later, they met. With Jung, already an accomplished and quite internationally famous psychiatrist. And so Jung and Freud were together for a while. And Freud really saw Jung as his successor, except for this strange preoccupation with religion and symbols and things like that. And so in 1909, only a few years after they had met, Jung began to develop other ideas. And when he published his book about that, he knew this is a break with Freud. And that's what happened. So from 1910, 12 on, Jung broke completely with Freud.
Did you admire William James's sort of take on things, the varieties of religious
I think William James, in a number of ways, sort of ran ahead of Jung. And some of his ideas Jung picked up and systematically explored, such as this idea. How does William James says that again? He says, our regular consciousness is separated by no more than a very flimsy screen from a much larger universal consciousness. And the slightest event, he doesn't use the word event, but let's say the slightest event can break through that screen or can tear that screen apart. So William James had himself discovered once, and because of laughing gas, I think in part, that you could suddenly have things well up in you that you didn't even realize before were there, and that would invade, and you would suddenly be in touch with something you hadn't been aware of at all. So that idea of a collective consciousness or unconscious. William James also saw the future for psychology in what people like Freud were doing. He met Jung in 1909, 1909, I believe, when Jung and Freud traveled together to the United States and got an honorary doctorate or something like that.
Right.
And then the old William James, who is going to die next year, I believe, met both, and he particularly liked Jung. And so you may even have gotten that idea from William James, but history doesn't tell us that. And he probably already had a sense of it before, but they agreed on that.
Right.
And William James admired Jung a lot. He had his doubts about Freud, but about the unconscious, he saw there the future of psychology in the next century, the 20th century.
Yeah.
And we say the 20th century was, amongst other things, also the age of discovery of the unconscious. Because there comes Freud in 1900 with his book on dreams, and there comes Jung in 1902 or 1906 with that book where he talks about the unconscious invading the process of word association. And of course later, the much bigger idea yet of the collective unconscious and the mystical unconscious and what have you.
Right. Yeah. Amazing. Okay, so final reflections in our conversation that you would share.
Well, I did think the other day a little bit more about some conclusions I've come to when it comes to the question of the meaning of life in general and particularly human life. But that's a longer story.
Mm.
I would rather do that some other time,
Okay.
if that would be possible.
Sure.
Well, everybody tries to think, right, of, okay, and what about it at the end, and what's it been good for?
Mm-hmm.
What is meaning? At least we can agree that the human animal is the meaning-making animal.
Mm-hmm.
If it is anything other than just being an animal, and I think it is. But okay, so everybody has to think about that at one time or another, even when they try to repress the whole thought of it. Well, what was the meaning of all this? That you were here and that you did what you did, or didn't do what you didn't do? Okay, so what? Does it have any meaning? Would it have made any difference if you had come to some other conclusions? But that's a big question. And I don't want to just sort of cut that short.
Okay.
If it's all right with you.
Yes, so we're going to come back next time and start there. Does that sound good?
Oh, sure.
So the story continues. You know, this was, I don't know if I mentioned this. William James closed, and my wife was there as a teacher. And she did a film called The Unfinished Conversation. And it was a documentary. I think I did mention this to you.
Yes, and you were going to show
I
it
was
to
going
me.
to show it to you. I think it would be fun to watch it together.
Sure.
If I brought it, could we watch it together?
Oh,
Because then she did a second film called The Conversation Continues.
oh,
And that was her conclusion. That even though they closed James, and it seemed like a very sad time with the end of this experiment on liberal education that also embraced professional education, that the two could work together, which is, you know, as a student there, my vocation has become media, right?
mm-hmm.
It's also my avocation, and it's also about my liberation, which is, I think, I learned from Marx, that what you do in the world is part of what liberates you, you know, and I love this idea of liberation, right?
I would say it can liberate
It can liberate you, right?
It has the potential.
But maybe that's the conversation we're going to have next time, is about liberation. Or what, I don't know if that's a topic for me that I think is still very important. And
well, the thinking I've done about that is what's liberated me from the corset that I was almost forced to wear at Calvin College and in the church.
Right, but it sounds to me, your story, the exit from there seems so natural, that it wasn't a forced, there wasn't anger there was just an understanding. They valued you enough that they tried to convince you to stay, and we'll do whatever.
Oh, yeah.
We'll even change some of our attitudes for you, that they really valued you.
Yes.
Because my experience is, you know, a lot of times you run up against this wall and you just, you know, because the common wisdom, don't burn bridges, right? That you should go to the next thing, but don't burn the bridge behind you. And I listen to you.
But what if the bridge doesn't lead you nowhere?
Well, I know, but
then you might as well burn it, right?
But I feel like with your story, you never burned it. You didn't burn it, and you left there as a respected scholar, and someone who made a contribution, and that was recognized, and then you just moved on to
That's true.
Grand Valley, and I really admire that. Good for you. I hope that those that will listen to this say there was a wise man, because I felt, if I think about what they did to me, I'm angry and I feel damaged. That I could have been a contender. That's that movie On the Waterfront with
Yeah, yeah,
Marlon Brando.
yeah.
I could have been a contender.
Mm.
So, okay, well, good session.
Thank you.
We've just